Welcome to another episode. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Share it in the comments below. And if you'd like to drift along with more of these journeys, you can gently subscribe so you always have a place to return when you want to slow down and listen. Tonight, we'll step into a story that reshaped how we see the world, not loudly, not suddenly, but in quiet, patient ways. A story told through glass, curved into lenses that gradually revealed what had always been hidden. Imagine a flea, magnified until every hair and joint looked monstrous on the page. Imagine a drop of water, suddenly teeming with tiny creatures no one had known existed. Imagine the wonder and the unease of realizing there were entire universes right under our noses, too small for the naked eye to catch. This is the quiet history of the microscope, a story of patience, of curiosity, of how seeing more closely changed the way we understand life itself. So settle in. This is your time. Let's begin. For most of human history, the limits of vision were the limits of knowledge. The naked eye could marvel at the sweep of the stars above, or the color of a butterfly's wing, but it could not go smaller. The invisible simply remained invisible, folded away into mystery. And yet, there has always been a human impulse to see further, to sharpen the edges of reality, to extend our senses beyond their natural reach. The very first steps toward magnification came not from the laboratories of science, but from the hands of artisans and craftsmen. Long before microscopes, before even spectacles, there were stones. In Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered small rock crystals polished into convex shapes, dating back to around 700 BCE. One such artifact, known as the Nimrud lens, was discovered in the ruins of the Assyrian palace at Nimrud. About 3 centimeters across, it could concentrate sunlight like a crude magnifying glass, and it may also have been used to help engravers carve fine details into jewelry or seals. Whether or not it was ever used to truly see in the way we think of magnification today, it hints at something important. Humans were already experimenting with bending light. The Romans, too, had their versions of magnifying tools. By the 1st century CE, writers like Seneca described using a globe of glass filled with water to magnify letters, easing the strain of reading. These so-called reading stones, convex pieces of glass laid directly on top of a page, could enlarge the letters just enough to make them easier for aging eyes to decipher. Simple, practical, but also quietly revolutionary. They revealed that vision could be extended, altered, improved. Still, for centuries, these tools remained humble. They were aids for craftsmen or reading devices for the elderly, not gateways into hidden worlds. The invisible remained untouched. It was in the Middle Ages that glasswork began to take on a new role. Around the 13th century, the first spectacles appeared in Europe. The exact inventor remains uncertain. Some credit Italian monks experimenting with convex lenses in Pisa around the 1280s. But by the early 14th century, spectacles were being made and sold widely in Venice and Florence. Imagine the impact. For the first time in history, people with failing eyesight could extend their ability to read and write. Knowledge, which had so often slipped away with age, could now be retained longer. Venice, in particular, became a hub for this new craft. The Venetian island of Murano, famous for its glassmakers, produced lenses of remarkable clarity. Their skill at melting and shaping silica, perfected in the making of mirrors and fine goblets, was quietly laying the groundwork for something far greater. They did not know it, of course. To them, these were spectacles, useful but ordinary. Yet the techniques they refined, grinding, polishing, experimenting with curvature, were exactly the skills that would later make microscopes and telescopes possible. The Netherlands, too, played its part. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Dutch spectacle makers had become renowned across Europe. Towns like Middelburg became small centers of optical experimentation. Traders carried lenses and glass across the seas, mingling with other inventions, other ideas. Europe at this time was a cauldron of change. Printing presses were spreading books, voyages of discovery were mapping the globe, and the Renaissance spirit of curiosity was turning people's attention not just outward to distant lands, but inward to the possibilities of human perception. This was the moment when magnifying glasses began to move from tools of necessity to tools of curiosity. Scholars, physicians, and natural philosophers began to wonder, if a lens could enlarge letters on a page, what else could it enlarge? Could it reveal structures in plants, in insects, in the fabric of nature itself? The 16th century is full of tantalizing glimpses of this shift. In drawings and notes, we find references to flea glasses, handheld magnifiers used by the curious to look at insects in extraordinary detail. These were not microscopes as we know them, but they carried the seed of the idea. If you could see more with a simple lens, then why not combine lenses, stack them, bend light further? There is something deeply human about this moment in history. The realization that our senses, once thought fixed, could be extended. Just as a ship could carry us beyond the horizon, a lens could carry our sight beyond its natural boundaries. And so, in small workshops in Venice and the Netherlands, men who called themselves spectacle makers were unknowingly preparing the stage for one of the greatest leaps in science. Their glass would soon become the eyes of discovery, not for the heavens above, as Galileo's telescope would show, but for the hidden worlds below, waiting quietly in a drop of water, a speck of dust, the body of a flea. Here we pause. The world is ready. The glass makers have honed their craft, the scholars are curious, the lenses exist. All that remains is the leap, from simple magnifiers to the first compound microscopes, devices that would open the invisible and forever change what it meant to see. By the late 1500s, Europe had become a land of glass. Venetian masters still guarded their recipes, Dutch traders carried lenses across seas, and spectacle makers in small towns honed their skills at the grinding wheel. In workshops lit by fire and candle, men bent over tiny discs of glass, testing curvatures, polishing edges, and, whether they realized it or not, reshaping the limits of human vision. It was in this setting, in the bustling Dutch town of Middelburg, that the microscope as we know it was born. The story, like many stories of invention, is wrapped in a haze of myth and fragmentary accounts. Some credit Hans Lippershey, the spectacle maker, who would also apply for the first telescope patent in 1608. Others point to Zacharias Janssen and his father, Hans, neighbors of Lippershey and fellow lens grinders. Still others suggest that invention floated naturally among these men, a product less of genius than of shared craft. What we know is this. Sometime around the final decade of the 16th century, in Middelburg, someone discovered that placing two lenses in sequence, one close to the object, the other closer to the eye, could create an effect neither lens alone could achieve. A compound microscope. The principle is simple in hindsight. A convex lens near the object creates a magnified image, but still at some distance. A second lens then magnifies that image again. Magnification stacked upon magnification. The effect was startling. Objects could appear many times larger than under a single magnifying glass. But simplicity in principle rarely means perfection in practice. Early compound microscopes were clumsy devices. Their tubes, often made of brass or wood, stretched awkwardly, sometimes over half a meter in length. The tiny glass lenses inside were prone to flaws, bubbles trapped in the glass, irregular curvatures, scratches that scattered light. When an observer peered through, they did not always find clarity. Instead, they might see halos of color around the edges, a shimmering blur, or darkening toward the center of the field. These distortions had names: chromatic aberration, spherical aberration, terms that hinted at the struggles of early optics, long before the science of lens design matured. Light itself was a problem. Without strong illumination, the tiny details magnified by the lenses appeared murky. Candlelight was dim and flickered. Sunlight could be focused, but not controlled. It would take centuries before artificial light could provide the steady, bright illumination microscopes needed. For those early pioneers, every observation required patience: moving mirrors, angling windows, chasing the sun across a desk. And yet, despite these frustrations, the compound microscope represented a leap into the unknown. Suddenly, the invisible was no longer beyond reach. Even if the images were distorted, they were larger than ever before. Fleas, lice, fragments of fabric, grains of sand, all could be seen in a new way. Why did this happen in Middelburg, of all places? Geography and trade played their part. The Netherlands in the late 16th century was a hub of commerce, ideas, and experimentation. Dutch ships sailed to the East Indies, returning with spices, textiles, and curiosities from across the world. Wealth flowed through towns like Middelburg, and with it came both leisure and curiosity. Merchants wanted novelties, gentlemen scholars wanted instruments, and spectacle makers seeking profit were only too happy to oblige. This culture of curiosity cannot be overstated. Europe was in the midst of the Renaissance, a time when natural philosophy was expanding beyond Aristotle's categories and into direct observation. Printing presses spread new discoveries rapidly. The telescope, invented almost simultaneously with the microscope, pointed eyes to the heavens. Why not also to the tiny worlds beneath our noses? The same hands that ground lenses for astronomy were now experimenting with lenses for biology. Still, for all its promise, the compound microscope was not yet the centerpiece of science. Many natural philosophers remained skeptical. What use was a device that produced blurry images, that exaggerated and distorted? Was one seeing the truth of nature or artifacts of flawed glass? Some even dismissed microscopes as little more than toys, curiosities for wealthy collectors to amuse themselves. And yet the instrument spread. By the early 1600s, microscopes were being built in Italy, Germany, and England. Galileo himself constructed one, calling it the occhiolino, the little eye. He used it to study the eyes of insects, the structure of plants, and he marveled at what he saw. In a letter, he described the infinite smallnesses revealed through the lenses. That phrase alone captured the essence of the microscope's power, to reveal infinities not in the vastness of space, but in the minuteness of life. The microscope's slow refinement mirrored the rhythm of the times. It was not an overnight revolution, but a steady accretion of improvements. Better glassmaking reduced bubbles. More precise grinding techniques produced smoother curvatures. Craftsmen experimented with tube lengths, lens spacing, and lighting. Each small adjustment nudged the instrument toward clarity. There is a quiet beauty in this process, knowledge advancing not in great leaps, but in tinkering, trial and error, persistence. The history of science is often told as a series of dramatic breakthroughs: Newton's apple, Darwin's voyage, Einstein's relativity. But the microscope reminds us that progress is also a patient story, one of artisans at their benches, polishing glass, testing, failing, and trying again. By the middle of the 17th century, microscopes had spread widely enough that they began to attract the attention of serious investigators. It was at this point that a young Englishman named Robert Hooke would take up the device and turn it into something extraordinary. He would not only peer through lenses, but also draw what he saw with an artist's skill and a scientist's curiosity. His book, Micrographia, would make the microscope famous and change how Europe thought about the hidden world. But that is still a step ahead. For now, we linger with the craftsman of Middelburg, the spectacle makers whose names echo faintly in history. The Janssens, Lippershey, perhaps others now lost. Their microscopes were crude, their images often flawed. But they held in their hands a new way of seeing, one that would eventually transform science, medicine, and philosophy itself. It is easy, from our vantage point, to smile at their imperfect instruments, to imagine the frustration of chasing a flea across a stage plate and squinting through distorted lenses. Yet within those imperfections lay the seed of an entire discipline: microbiology, pathology, cell theory, even genetics. All the worlds we now know within a drop of blood or a smear of saliva began in those blurry circles of light. And so, out of curiosity and craft, trade and tinkering, the microscope was born, not in a blaze of clarity, but in a fog of distortion, a tool fragile, frustrating, and flawed, but also profoundly promising, a device that whispered of hidden worlds, waiting patiently for sharper eyes to reveal them. By the middle of the 17th century, microscopes had already begun to circulate among Europe's curious minds. They were fragile, awkward instruments, often dismissed as novelties, but in the right hands they could unlock something astonishing. No one demonstrated this more powerfully than Robert Hooke. Hooke was not a man of narrow talents. Born in 1635 on the Isle of Wight, he trained first as an artist, showing skill in drawing and mechanical design, before studying science under some of England's greatest minds. He would go on to become a central figure of the Royal Society in London, serving as its curator of experiments, a role that required him to design and demonstrate scientific wonders to the learned gentlemen of the age. Hooke built air pumps, tested springs, sketched fossils, and even helped rebuild London after the Great Fire. But it was his work with the microscope that left perhaps his most enduring mark. In 1665, Hooke published Micrographia. It was more than just a book, it was a revelation. The volume was large and heavy, printed on fine paper, filled with detailed engravings based on Hooke's meticulous drawings, and it was the first major scientific work to be published by the newly formed Royal Society, a group dedicated to advancing knowledge through experiment and observation. Micrographia was meant to astonish, and it succeeded. Inside its pages, readers encountered a hidden world laid bare. Hooke turned his microscope to the everyday: a slice of cork, the edge of a needle, the wing of a fly, the point of a razor. He described what he saw with careful words and illustrated it with astonishing accuracy. The book was not dry. It was alive with curiosity, blending science and art in a way that few had seen before. One image in particular captured the imagination of Europe: the flea. Under Hooke's pen, magnified by his lenses, the humble flea became a monstrous creature, bristling with hairs, armored in plates, its limbs jointed like a machine. Every detail, down to the claws at the tips of its legs, was rendered with shocking realism. Readers who had known fleas only as irritating specks now confronted them as alien beasts, intricate and terrifying. The engraving was so vivid that it became famous across the continent. Samuel Pepys, the English diarist, wrote that Micrographia was the most ingenious book that I ever read in my life. There is a strange paradox here. Hooke's flea was both repellent and beautiful. On the one hand, it unsettled people to imagine that such complex and armored creatures lived in their sheets and clothing. On the other hand, the drawing revealed a hidden artistry in nature, a structure more intricate than any human craftsman could design. This mixture of horror and wonder became a hallmark of the microscope's impact. To see the small was not always comforting. Sometimes it meant discovering complexity where simplicity had been assumed. Hooke's drawings extended beyond insects. His sketch of a thin slice of cork introduced another word to science: cell. When he looked at the structure, he saw tiny, box-like compartments, which reminded him of the small rooms, or cells, in a monastery. He could not know then that he was glimpsing the fundamental unit of life, but the word remained, and biology would build upon it centuries later. What made Micrographia so powerful was not just its content, but its presentation. Hooke understood that science needed to be seen as well as described. His drawings were not rough sketches, they were polished engravings, carefully shaded to convey depth and detail. They gave readers the illusion that they too were looking through the microscope. In a time before photography, this was as close as one could get to sharing a direct vision of the invisible. The blending of art and science was deliberate. Hooke himself had trained as an artist before turning to science, and he never abandoned that sensibility. For him, observation was not just about recording facts, but about capturing beauty, about making the invisible vivid to the imagination. The flea drawing was not only an illustration of an insect, it was a portrait of a hidden world. But Micrographia was more than a picture book. Hooke filled its pages with philosophical reflections, meditations on what it meant to peer into these tiny worlds. He marveled at the structures he saw, suggesting that nature worked through patterns and designs invisible to the naked eye. The microscope, he argued, revealed order where once there had seemed only chaos. Dust, mold, fibers, even the edge of a blade, all had structure, all bore the marks of nature's hidden craftsmanship. Hooke's reflections were not always comfortable. He speculated that diseases might arise from these tiny structures, hinting at the connection between microbes and illness long before germ theory. He wondered about the complexity of creatures too small to be seen without aid, suggesting that the universe might be filled with hidden life beyond our reckoning. In this way, Micrographia did not just display curiosities, it expanded philosophy. It forced readers to confront the limits of their own senses, to ask how much of reality lay forever beyond the unaided eye. It is important to remember the context of the time. In the mid-1600s, Europe was only just emerging from medieval frameworks of thought. The telescope had recently shown that Earth was not the center of the cosmos. The microscope now suggested that the world itself was not as it seemed, that beneath every surface lay new worlds. For many readers, this was unsettling, even disorienting. To read Micrographia was to realize that the fabric of everyday life, the dust on a shelf, the leaf on a tree, the insect on your skin, contained vast, unsuspected intricacy. The popularity of Micrographia cannot be overstated. It was read not only by scientists, but by the educated public, who were captivated by its images and ideas. It established the microscope as more than a curiosity. It gave the instrument credibility, a place in the pursuit of knowledge, and it secured Hooke's reputation as one of the great observers of his age. There is a poetic symmetry in Hooke's work. While Galileo had turned his telescope to the heavens and shown that the universe was more complex than imagined, Hooke had turned his microscope to the small and revealed universes in miniature. The two instruments, born of similar lenses, expanded human vision in opposite directions, outward to the infinite, inward to the infinitesimal. Both humbled human arrogance, reminding us that our senses alone perceive only a narrow band of reality. For Hooke, the lesson of the microscope was humility and wonder. He wrote that these instruments allowed us to discover a new visible world. And indeed, they had. The flea, the cork, the needle, familiar objects transformed into revelations. To look through the microscope was to feel as though one had crossed a threshold, entering lands no traveler had ever mapped. The flea drawing still endures today as a symbol of that moment. More than 3.5 centuries later, the engraving still has the power to astonish. We live in an age of electron microscopes, of images of viruses and proteins at atomic scale. And yet, Hooke's flea retains its force, a reminder of the first time Europe truly stared into the abyss of the small and felt both fear and awe. Micrographia was not just the birth of a book, but the birth of a vision, that the world is layered with unseen structures, that the invisible can be revealed with patience and glass. Hooke invited readers to look closer, to doubt the sufficiency of their eyes, and to embrace the strange beauty of the hidden. And in doing so, he laid the foundation for a revolution that would stretch into biology, medicine, and philosophy. For once, people had seen the invisible. They could never again pretend it wasn't there. If Robert Hooke gave the microscope its public stage, then Antonie van Leeuwenhoek gave it its soul. He was not a scholar in the traditional sense, not a gentleman of science with university training. He was a tradesman from the Dutch city of Delft, a man whose life seemed ordinary on the surface. Born in 1632, apprenticed as a draper, working among bolts of cloth and the bustling rhythms of a merchant town. And yet, through patience, craft, and obsession, he would become the first human being to lay eyes on entire kingdoms of life hidden from everyone before him. Unlike Hooke, van Leeuwenhoek did not build compound microscopes with multiple lenses. He went the opposite way. He perfected the single lens. To most, a simple magnifying glass was just that, simple. But van Leeuwenhoek discovered that if one ground and polished a tiny bead of glass with extraordinary care, it could act as a lens of remarkable power. His microscopes were small, almost toy-like in appearance, little brass plates with a pin for holding the specimen, a single lens mounted in the middle, and screws to adjust focus. They could fit in the palm of his hand, and yet these tiny instruments had magnifying powers that outstripped the larger compound microscopes of his day. It was his craftsmanship that made the difference. Van Leeuwenhoek had an almost meditative dedication to lens grinding, producing hundreds of lenses in his lifetime. He never revealed his exact methods, perhaps to maintain a competitive advantage, perhaps simply because he was secretive by nature. Some modern reconstructions suggest he may have melted thin threads of glass into tiny droplets, which, when hardened, formed nearly perfect spheres. These spheres, mounted carefully, provided astonishing clarity. Armed with these miniature devices, van Leeuwenhoek began to look. At first, his observations tied directly to his trade as a draper. He used his microscopes to inspect the weave and quality of cloth. But his curiosity soon wandered further. He looked at insects, at plants, at the fine structures of everyday things. And then, sometime in the 1670s, he began to peer into places no one had thought to look. Drops of pond water, scrapings from his own teeth, samples of bodily fluids. What he found defied imagination. In a single drop of water, he saw countless tiny creatures swimming, wriggling, darting, spiraling. He described them as animalcules, little animals. Some were round, some elongated, some spiraled like corkscrews. He found them in rainwater, in the water he used to soak peppercorns, even in the scum scraped from his own mouth. Everywhere he looked, life teemed where no one had suspected it. His letters to the Royal Society in London captured these discoveries in extraordinary detail. At first, the learned men of England were sceptical. Could a Dutch draper with no formal training truly be seeing invisible animals in a drop of water? The Royal Society sent investigators, including Hooke himself, to verify the claims. When Hooke peered through van Leeuwenhoek's lenses and confirmed the wriggling forms, the skepticism began to melt. But van Leeuwenhoek's revelations did not stop there. He turned his microscopes to human and animal tissues, describing blood cells with remarkable accuracy. He examined the circulation of blood in tiny capillaries. He looked at muscle fibers, discovering their striated structure. In 1677, in one of his most startling observations, he described sperm cells in semen, noting their tails and their swimming motion. For the first time, human reproduction itself was glimpsed at the cellular level. It was as though he had opened windows into every secret corner of life. The reactions were mixed. Some were awestruck, others disturbed. The idea that semen contained thousands of living, swimming entities was unsettling to a culture still wrestling with questions of generation and the soul. And yet, van Leeuwenhoek persisted, carefully reporting what he saw, often in language both precise and poetic. His style was not that of a philosopher speculating, but of an observer simply describing faithfully. He was, in his own way, humble. He did not pretend to know why these creatures existed, only that they did. Over the course of decades, van Leeuwenhoek sent hundreds of letters to the Royal Society, describing a world of microbes, cells, and structures no one else had seen. Slowly, the learned societies of Europe accepted him. Though he never left Delft, his observations travelled across the continent, reshaping biology and medicine in ways he could scarcely have foreseen. And yet, it is worth noting how reluctant a revolutionary he truly was. Van Leeuwenhoek never sought to overturn theories of disease or propose bold philosophies of life. He remained a tradesman at heart, curious but practical. He did not publish a grand book like Hooke's Micrographia. Instead, he wrote letters, often in Dutch, translated into Latin or English by others. He worked alone, without students or followers, and when he died in 1723, much of his lens-making technique died with him. But his impact could not be buried. In those tiny brass microscopes, barely larger than a matchbox, van Leeuwenhoek had seen bacteria, protozoa, sperm, and blood cells. He had cracked open the door to microbiology. Centuries later, Pasteur and Koch would build germ theory on foundations that van Leeuwenhoek had unknowingly laid. Modern medicine, sanitation, and biology all trace part of their lineage back to the quiet draper in Delft. There is something profoundly poetic in his story. While Hooke dazzled Europe with grand engravings, van Leeuwenhoek sat alone, peering into drops of water and seeing entire universes. He was not trying to shock or entertain. He was simply curious. His microscopes did not magnify fame. They magnified truth. When we think of scientific revolutions, we often picture lectures, debates, and proclamations. But sometimes a revolution begins in silence, in the stillness of a small workshop, in the patience of a man grinding glass beads smaller than a pinhead. Van Leeuwenhoek's revolution was not loud. It was a whisper through a lens, a whisper that told us the world was teeming with life we had never imagined. Today, looking back, it is difficult not to feel awe for the sheer scale of what he accomplished. With lenses so small they could be lost between two fingers, van Leeuwenhoek became the first to see bacteria, creatures that would later be revealed as causes of plague and cholera, fermentation and decay, but also as essential partners in digestion and ecosystems. He saw spermatozoa, the carriers of life itself. He saw red blood cells, the couriers of oxygen. He saw protozoa, tiny single-celled organisms drifting like cosmic voyagers in a drop of water. All of it, revealed not by institutions or armies of scholars, but by one man's craft and curiosity. The Royal Society, once doubtful, came to revere him. They elected him a fellow, corresponded with him for decades, and preserved many of his letters. Even kings and queens sought audiences with him, travelling to Delft to peer through his mysterious lenses. And yet, he never sought wealth or fame. He remained in his city, living a modest life, polishing glass, peering into hidden worlds. If Hooke's Micrographia had startled Europe into recognizing the microscope's potential, van Leeuwenhoek's discoveries gave the instrument its permanence. He proved that it was not a toy, but a tool capable of revealing realities beyond imagination. His patient, meticulous work transformed curiosity into discovery. And so, the reluctant revolutionary from Delft gave humanity new eyes, eyes that saw not only the grand structures of insects and plants, but the microscopic foundations of life itself. For all its wonders, the microscope did not instantly transform medicine. It revealed strange new worlds. Yes, Hooke's intricate insects, van Leeuwenhoek's animalcules. But for decades, physicians remained skeptical. Medicine in the 17th and 18th centuries was still rooted in ancient traditions. Galen's humours, Hippocrates' balance of bodily fluids, the vague notion of miasmas, or bad air causing disease. The idea that invisible creatures might be responsible for illness seemed far-fetched, almost absurd. In part, the skepticism was practical. Early microscopes were difficult to use, their lenses distorted, their light sources flickered. What one observer saw might not be exactly what another saw. Physicians, trained to trust experience at the bedside, were reluctant to base their diagnoses on what seemed like optical illusions. Was that wriggling speck really alive, or just a trick of glass and sunlight? Many dismissed van Leeuwenhoek's animalcules as curiosities, irrelevant to the pressing business of treating patients. And so, through the 18th century, medicine advanced in its own ways. New anatomy, better surgery, improved descriptions of diseases. But the microscope hovered at the edges, more a natural philosopher's tool than a doctor's instrument. A handful of early microscopists did try to link the tiny creatures to disease. In 1683, van Leeuwenhoek himself reported finding animalcules in the tartar scraped from teeth, hinting at a connection to decay. Later, in the 18th century, a few physicians speculated that invisible organisms might cause infections. But without clear evidence, without reproducible experiments, these ideas remained little more than speculation. The turning point came slowly in the 19th century, when the microscope itself improved. Advances in lens grinding reduced distortions. Achromatic lenses corrected the rainbow halos that plagued earlier instruments. Artificial illumination, oil lamps, mirrors, eventually gas and electric lights, made observation steadier and brighter. Suddenly, what had once been vague blurs became sharp structures. Cells could be studied, tissues examined, microbes observed with undeniable clarity. It was in this new age of precision that medicine began to change. In the 1830s, the German botanist Matthias Schleiden and zoologist Theodor Schwann proposed what we now call cell theory, that all living things are made of cells, and that the cell is the basic unit of life. This idea, grounded in countless microscopic observations, reoriented biology. The body was no longer a mysterious balance of fluids, it was a vast community of living units. Then, in the mid-19th century, came the breakthrough that tied microbes directly to disease: germ theory. Louis Pasteur, in France, used careful experiments to show that fermentation was caused not by spontaneous processes, but by living microorganisms. He demonstrated that broth left exposed to air would teem with microbes, while broth in sealed flasks remained sterile. Pasteur's work dismantled the old idea of spontaneous generation and pointed to microbes as active agents in decay and disease. Building on this foundation, Robert Koch, a German physician, carried the microscope into the heart of medicine. In the 1870s and 1880s, Koch developed methods to isolate and identify specific microbes, staining them with dyes, cultivating them on solid media, and observing them under the microscope. He proved that particular microbes caused particular diseases: Bacillus anthracis for anthrax, Mycobacterium tuberculosis for tuberculosis, Vibrio cholerae for cholera. His meticulous studies gave medicine the clarity it had long lacked. Not just speculation about invisible agents, but visual, reproducible evidence. The impact was profound. Diseases that had haunted humanity for centuries, tuberculosis, cholera, plague, were no longer mysterious curses or miasmas. They had identifiable causes, creatures with names and forms, visible under the microscope. For the first time, medicine could target disease at its root. Microscopy now became essential to pathology. Doctors used it to examine tissues, identifying the cellular changes of disease. Blood smears revealed parasites like the malaria-causing Plasmodium. Sputum samples revealed the rods of tuberculosis. Diagnosis became not just a matter of symptoms, but of microscopic evidence. Public health, too, was transformed. If cholera was caused by a bacterium in contaminated water, then sanitation became a matter of life and death. If tuberculosis spread through microscopic organisms in the lungs, then isolation and hygiene became crucial. Cities built sewer systems, filtered water supplies, and launched public health campaigns, all grounded in the tiny revelations of the microscope. And yet, the transformation was not immediate or easy. Many resisted germ theory, clinging to older ideas of miasmas or constitutional weakness. Change in medicine has always come slowly, not because the evidence is weak, but because habits of thought are strong. But once microbes were seen, once their forms were drawn, stained, photographed, resistance became harder to maintain. There is something quietly poetic about this progression. The microscope began as a toy of spectacle makers, dismissed as a curiosity. For 2 centuries it showed marvels, but little practical value. And then, slowly, patiently, it reshaped medicine itself. It did not do so with fireworks, but with steady accumulation. Clearer lenses, sharper images, careful experiments, undeniable proofs. The result was a shift as profound as any in the history of science. Just as astronomy had dethroned Earth from the center of the cosmos, microscopy dethroned human certainty about health. Disease was no longer mysterious or inevitable. It had causes, tiny, living causes, that could be studied, prevented, even defeated. From Pasteur's laboratory flasks to Koch's stained slides, from the hospitals of Europe to the sewers of London, the microscope quietly changed how humanity understood the body and disease. It gave us germ theory, modern pathology, vaccines, antiseptics, and public health systems. It extended life expectancy, reduced suffering, and reshaped human destiny. And it all began with glass, with the patient curiosity of men peering into drops of water and slices of tissue. The slow impact of microscopy on medicine is a reminder that revolutions are not always sudden. Sometimes they unfold in whispers, over centuries, until the world looks back and realizes how much has changed. The microscope, like the telescope, did more than expand knowledge. It expanded perspective. It bent the human gaze into realms once thought unreachable, and in doing so, it quietly humbled us. For centuries, people had believed that the naked eye revealed the world as it truly was. What you could see was what existed. To look at a drop of water was to see something pure, transparent, lifeless. To see a flea was to glance at a speck of irritation, nothing more. The microscope shattered that illusion. Suddenly, a drop of water was an ocean of tiny swimmers, a stage for creatures whose existence had never been suspected. Suddenly, the flea was not a nuisance, but an armored beast, complex, jointed, bristling with design. There is a kind of arrogance in assuming that reality matches our senses. The microscope stripped that away. It whispered that what we see is not the whole of the world, but only a narrow slice of it, the slice our eyes are tuned to. Beneath, beyond, within, there is always more. This humbling was not new in spirit. Just decades before Hooke and van Leeuwenhoek, Galileo had turned his telescope skyward and discovered that Jupiter had moons, that Saturn had rings, that the Milky Way was a river of countless stars. The heavens, once thought perfect and unchanging, were revealed to be populated, dynamic, infinitely more vast than human imagination had pictured. The telescope expanded the universe outward. The microscope expanded it inward. Between them, human beings found themselves caught in the middle, dwarfed not only by the scale of the cosmos, but also by the intricacy of the minuscule. There is a quiet symmetry here. The telescope showed that Earth was not the center of the universe. The microscope showed that humans were not the measure of life. Both instruments pressed against human pride, reminding us that reality does not revolve around what we can see unaided. And yet, far from despairing, many found wonder in this realization. To know that a drop of pond water contains entire ecosystems is to see the universe reflected in miniature. To know that our own bodies are made of countless cells, each alive with its own structures, is to recognize complexity within ourselves. The microscope turned ordinary things, dust, mold, leaves, blood, into galaxies of form and function. It also raised questions that reach beyond science. What is scale, after all, but a matter of perception? A mountain feels immense to us, yet compared to Earth, it is a wrinkle. Earth itself is a speck against the sun a grain against the galaxy a shimmer against the observable universe. And then, in the other direction, a human is a colony of cells, each cell a city of molecules, each molecule a dance of atoms, each atom a blur of particles. Where does it end? How small is small? How large is large? The microscope and telescope together remind us that boundaries of scale are illusions drawn by the limits of our senses. In this way, the microscope is not just an instrument of science, but an instrument of philosophy. It forces us to question how much of reality we fail to see. What worlds exist, still invisible, waiting for some future lens to reveal them? Centuries ago, Van Leeuwenhoek peered into a drop of water and found animalcules. Today, electron microscopes reveal viruses, proteins, even the arrangement of atoms. Tomorrow, who knows? Perhaps we will peer deeper still, into quantum realms where matter dissolves into probabilities. There is also a poetic comfort in the thought that reality is richer than perception. It means that mystery remains, that no matter how closely we look, there will always be more to see. The microscope teaches us that the familiar is inexhaustible. A leaf, a grain of sand, a single cell, each can unfold into wonder if given the right lens. And in that sense, the microscope is not only humbling, but also ennobling. It tells us that curiosity is worthwhile, that patience with the small reveals universes, that human senses may be limited, but human imagination and ingenuity can extend them. We cannot see microbes with our naked eyes, but with ground glass and focused light, we can bring them into view. The lesson is profound. The invisible is not the non-existent. What we cannot see may still shape our lives, our health, our world. Disease, decay, fermentation, even our very reproduction, all depend on the microscopic. The microscope made visible what had always been real, and so, in the quiet of its glass lenses, the microscope echoes the telescope. Both instruments remind us that reality exceeds us. Both teach humility, both inspire awe. One stretches our gaze to galaxies, the other to animalcules. Together, they sketch humanity's place, suspended between immensities, forever learning that to look closer is to discover more. Today, the microscope has far surpassed anything Hooke or Van Leeuwenhoek could have imagined. With electron microscopes, we can now see viruses and proteins in astonishing detail. Atomic force microscopes let us trace the contours of individual atoms, mapping the very scaffolding of matter itself. The invisible has been pushed back again and again, until even the unimaginably small can be rendered as images, patterns, data. And yet, for all our modern precision, the wonder of those first glimpses remains unmatched. Hooke's flea, engraved in copper and printed in 1665, still has the power to shock, not because of its scientific accuracy, but because of what it represented. The first time a human eye, aided by glass, truly saw a familiar world transformed into something alien. Van Leeuwenhoek's animalcules, wriggling in a drop of water, were not only microbes. They were the moment humanity realized that life extended far beyond what sight could grasp. That is the quiet truth the microscope carries. Seeing changes, knowing. Once we have looked closer, we can never unsee. The drop of water is never just water again. The body is never just flesh and blood. Even the dust motes, drifting in sunlight, whisper of unseen kingdoms. As we sit in the present, with instruments that can resolve the invisible in extraordinary clarity, it is worth pausing to thank those who came before. The lens grinders of Venice and Middelburg, who polished glass with patience. The tinkerers who stacked lenses into tubes. Hooke, who gave the invisible an image. Van Leeuwenhoek, who gave it life. Their tools were imperfect, their images often blurred, but their curiosity was sharp enough to cut through centuries of ignorance. The history of the microscope is not loud. It is not a story of sudden revolutions or dramatic battles. It is a story of quiet persistence, of curiosity bending light, of artisans and observers who refuse to stop looking. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest changes come not with thunder, but with silence, with glass, with patience, with the decision to peer more closely. And so, as this journey draws to a close, let's carry that lesson with us, that the world is always richer than it appears, that the invisible is never empty, and that wonder waits in every direction we choose to look. Thank you for joining me tonight, for listening, and for drifting through this quiet history. May it leave you with a sense of how much lies hidden all around us and how much remains to be seen. Rest well. Good night.